we get to Corbyn and then maybe discuss all this stuff after? What do you think about that?
I would love to. I would love to. So let's do it. It's the moment you guys have all been waiting for, so we won't make you wait any longer. Joining us now is Jeremy Corbyn, a member of Parliament and also the former leader of the Labour Party, and he's the recent founder of the Peace and Justice Project. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm in the Peace and Justice Project office now on a Saturday evening. Myself and Lara are the only people in the whole building, and it's really strange being in an office on a Saturday evening when outside is all quiet, but there we are. Anyway, thank you for inviting me on. It's really a pleasure to see you, and I enjoyed the discussion you were just having about Wall Street fiddling and Wall Street fiddlers, as we call them over here.
Well, that's actually a perfect segue. Why don't we start with that very topic? I mean, what are your thoughts on what transpired in the markets this week with Wall Street bets?
Well, I think the way you summed it up was very good, because what you pointed out was that these people knew the corona crisis was coming. They got a pretty good idea of how serious it was going to be, and they worked out that a lockdown would mean people would work from home. Therefore, telecoms was going to become much more important. Delivery systems going to become much more important. And that's where to put their money. There's also been a lot of, in Britain anyway, I don't know about across your side of the Atlantic, of big store groups closing down, and a lot of asset stripping of property at the present time, of shops, big shops often, that have closed down altogether. And of course, a lot of smaller shops that are unlikely to reopen again. And so there's already a quite devastating effect on local economies all over the country. And we've argued that if the government is requiring people to stay and work at home, I can understand that, and that's obviously the correct response in order to stop the spread of the virus. But if, as a government, you're saying people must not go out to work and they cannot work from home, as many cannot, then you've got to provide them with the wherewithal to survive. And I must say, we've had some fairly bizarre conversations with the Prime Minister about this. When I was leader of the opposition last year, I had one meeting with him with a number of colleagues, and he then told me that everybody got to work from home. And I said, what about the self-employed? And he said, well, they can work from home as well. I said, well, it's not much point saying to a self-employed plumber, electrician or bricklayer, you've got to work from home. And he said, good point. We're not necessarily dealing with a government that's on top of the subject or the most prepared to deal with this crisis by any means, but it has exposed the heroes and the villains within our society. In Britain, to me, the heroes are the hospital workers, the care workers, the delivery workers, the cleaners, the transport workers, all of those people that have put their lives on the line in order to help others. The villains have been those that have speculated, and those companies that have been handed massive contracts to inadequately provide personal protective equipment or set up a trace and track system which simply didn't work, and billions has been handed out in private health contracts by our government. And so our response has always been there has to be a public response. But the other side of it is a very interesting political response, and I think from the way you were talking, the same thing is happening in the USA, that we've got what we call mutual aid groups within our communities. In my own constituency where I am at the moment, there is one community aid group for each ward, and there are 8 wards in a population of less than 100,000 people. And each of those mutual aid groups collects food, delivers food, gives support to people, gives mental health counselling, gives financial advice, and gives all that kind of support. And it's been a coming together of the millennial generation that didn't think these things were ever going to happen to them, middle-aged people who thought they were okay and then discovered they weren't, and older people who feel very alone and very isolated. And so whilst there are unbelievable levels of stress amongst many people in many homes, there is also a rejuvenation of community politics. And I think that's something that we're all going to have to reckon with in the future. And I think that if there is a positive to come out of that, that is the positive. But the other negative is it's the poorest people, it's the black minority ethnic community that disproportionately died as a result of this. And globally, the supply of the vaccine is unbelievably, grotesquely unfair, where high prices are being charged by big pharma for vaccines to poorer countries. And as the Director General of the World Health Organization pointed out last week, it's what he described as a moral scandal that the poorest people in the poorest countries will be looking at a vaccine in 2-3 years' time, if they're lucky. And so it's exposed an awful lot about inequality and injustice in our society. And I'm sure in the USA, if you look across the piece, you'll find that the death rate is disproportionate amongst the black and minority ethnic community and in the big cities of your country.
Mr. Corbyn, not to make the moment awkward, but I was wondering if you could maybe pull your camera down a little bit, because you have a lot of headroom and we want to make sure our audience can see you clearly.
You know what? I read your mind for the second time. I was about to do that, but I was trying to work out how to do it on screen without looking a bit odd. And if you still wave to somebody off screen, please come and move the camera. That looks even worse.
Well, you look great now. So it's all.
Thank you very much. I cut my hair especially, but we're not allowed to go to the barbers, so there we go.
Oh well, I mean, honestly, I couldn't tell. It looks professionally done to me. So I want to ask you about, because I think that one of the reasons why you and Bernie Sanders have resonated so much with younger people in the last few years. I mean, it seems anachronistic in some way, no offense. But one of the reasons is because you guys have so much experience and have been on the front lines of these struggles for so long, including in the sort of dark days of, the 80s and 90s for the left and things like that. And it's just wild to think that a labor leader in the 21st century was, you were in Chile in 1969 before visiting Allende and all the stuff that they were doing there. What does that experience teach you, and how does that inform the way you currently interpret the current crisis that we're in?
My determination is to build a society that's fit for the next generation, because what we've seen over the past 30, 40 years has been the growth of free market economics from the 1970s, Chicago School, the Reagan campaign in California before he was elected, Proposition 13, you probably remember it, to cut taxes. Mm-hmm. The same thing resonated in the Conservative Party in Britain. And so the kind of post-war consensus of properly funded public services, maybe not as adequate as they could be, but nevertheless, the principle of properly funded public services and graduated taxation, where the very richest paid the most, was something that was blown apart by Reagan in the USA and by Thatcher in Britain. And as somebody who had been in the labor movement all of my life, and was a union organizer in the 1970s. I remember when the Conservatives started talking about privatization, I was at a union meeting of cleaners in a school, because that was the union I organized. It was the National Union of Public Employees. And I was talking about the horrors of what this Tory party might do if they ever got into office. And a hand went up and said, Jeremy, can I ask you a question? I said, yeah, sure. What is it? She said, what's privatization? Because it wasn't in their ken, as we say. You just weren't thinking about that. And we certainly found out what it was a very short time later when Thatcher was elected in Britain, Reagan in the USA, and we went on this binge of destroying public services, destroying public assets, selling them off for a song, and the profiteers moved in. And Thatcher changed the agenda from being the politics of values to the politics of money. And so she destroyed large portions of our manufacturing industry in order to create a sort of money economy where you worship money, you invested money to make money, and all the sort of notions of the hedge funds and so on. And that has been the story ever since. And I've got the utmost respect for Bernie Sanders, and the Squad, and all the radical movements in the USA that have organized in communities against poverty, that have organized people to stand up against that. And I remember the Occupy movement and all that went with it. So I think it's fascinating, the times that we're in now, where we've got in Britain sadly a Conservative government elected on a promise of doing an effective trade deal with the European Union that would protect workers' rights and environmental rights, whilst at the same time trying to do a deal with Donald Trump, who was looking in exactly the opposite direction. And we now have the Biden administration that's just come in, and I hope that they are going to reverse the trend that Trump set in place. Now, for all the sort of stuff one can say about Trump, the headline figure that should be looked at is this fake populism of Trump, this fake love for the working class of Trump. In reality, he presided over 4 years of unbelievably rapid transfer of power and wealth from the poorest to the richest. And that is exactly what his sort of free market agenda is about.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that you mentioned Prop 13. It's actually incredible that Prop 13 is on anyone's radar, because it was a proposition in California that had devastating results, especially for our education system. Passed in 1978 and capped the property taxes for California homes to a little over 1%. And that cut funding for education so much that the Los Angeles Unified School District went from being the top school district in the country to now being one of the worst school districts in the country. So thank you for mentioning that, because it's a good example of how these little ballot initiatives that some might think have no impact on their personal lives actually ends up having a massive impact on the quality of social services and public programs that are offered to people.
And at the time, it sounded totally obscure and a bit niche. I mean, what are you all bothered about Proposition 13 for? Well, yeah. Look at the effects.
Yeah,
absolutely. Just devastating effects. Later. So I actually want to ask you a follow-up about what you just mentioned regarding Trump's fake populism and what he actually did implement once he had power, which again was an acceleration of that transfer of wealth from the middle class to the already wealthy. What I'm concerned about is, during the New Deal era, we were able to pass policies that were desperately needed, the New Deal, because there was organized labor that had power pushing for it. There was an organized left. Right now, though, at least in the United States, I can say with certainty that organized labor doesn't exist. Labor has no power. And I'm wondering what the left can do to prevent like an actual right-wing fascist from taking power.
Well, the New Deal era is, to me, absolutely fascinating, because at one level you could describe New Deal as saving American capitalism. There was an element of that in it, for sure. But there was also the flowering of an artistic talent across the country, a flowering of working class culture and an extolling of it. And there's a fascinating museum and exhibition in San Francisco I saw a couple of years ago, which went through many of the murals of Diego Rivera and others, but it was all about the way in which there was investment all across the country. There was that sort of hope, the kind of Norman Rockwell paintings and so on, that gave some idea of what workers could achieve together and how the society could be made much fairer. I mean, there were many areas of the Roosevelt years, the FDR years and the New Deal that one should look at with a great deal of criticism. Lynching went on. Racism was not tackled at all. Black people were denied the vote. The abuse of civil rights by many people, and the rhetoric against the communists and Communist Party at that time, going through to the McCarthyite era after the war. I mean, the life of Paul Robeson and others is an interesting example of the way they were treated. But I say that because I think the analysis of our own history is a very important thing to do. Likewise, the post-war Labour government in Britain quite brilliantly brought in the National Health Service, a planning system that was much fairer, that developed a lot of council housing, and was immense in its achievements on the domestic agenda. It was very different on the international stage. With the exception of the independence of India that was forced on them anyway, they continued with colonial wars, and the government actually secretly developed nuclear weapons at that time. And so, I think we have to analyze without rose-tinted glasses the period at that time. Now, you say organized labor is very weak. Yes, it has been weakened by legislation in your country and in mine, but it's also become much stronger in certain areas. I'll give you an example. In the last couple of months, British Airways, major airline, major employer in Britain, wanted to fire almost its entire workforce and rehire them on worse conditions. They failed. They were defeated by the power of the union, and they had to negotiate with the unions in the proper manner. And so I think the way forward for the left is that we use the power of social media and communication, such as we're doing now, because I don't imagine that Fox News would give this amount of time for this kind of discussion. Just a thought. We do have the ability to communicate with each other, and that has speeded up during the corona crisis. I mean, I'm doing meetings in this very room almost every day with friends in India, in South Africa, in all over Latin America, in your country, and so on. We have internationalized a lot of what we're doing. And I do think that we've got to be active in the support of people who are campaigning against the principles of free market economics and what it does to people's lives. And so the support that we should be mobilizing, and I'm sure you are, for the Indian farmers at the present time is very important, because their struggle against the idea that a price support system to give a base income to farmers growing basic crops in India will be removed, will mean that US agribusiness and others can then move in and take over, as they did when structural adjustment programs were imposed on the poorest countries in Africa and Latin America. So we've got to organize in communities and in solidarity with each other, and also support the principle of what trade unions are about. And so whilst, yes, the levels of union membership in the USA are sadly probably somewhere near his historic low, I still think it's right to spend a lot of time and energy in building union membership in new areas, because manufacturing industry is a different animal altogether. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was last year, I was visiting a highly efficient tin plate rolling mill in Britain, which put tin coating on steel sheets. And there was hardly anybody there. There was about 24 much older workers who had been in the steel industry all their lives, half a dozen young apprentices, and that was about it. Manufacturing industry is very highly recognized. Where the labor intensity has moved to is in care, is in health, is in public services, and is in the new economy of delivery workers and delivery riders. They need to be in a union. And at the moment, there are people who are trying to organize in Amazon. There was the Global Day for Amazon, which Progressive International got behind and lots of us got behind. I think it's those kind of campaigns that the left have got to get involved in to win You've got to win the cultural war in the communities in the first place, to give people hope and not the idea they have no power. And that is where Bernie and I are absolutely at one. Obviously, I'm very sorry that he didn't make it through to being the presidential candidate. And he and I exchanged very nice messages. He's a good man.
He is a good man. We love him. We love him very much here. But we've covered the Indian farmers' struggle on this show. We've covered the Amazon union drive. There's also a union drive at Google.
None of my criticisms of the media are directed at you.
No. Obviously, no. I'm not trying to. I'm not trying to sort of defend ourselves. But I guess what I'm saying is that I was struck by when we cover those things, which are just not covered in the media at all in the United States, at all. Like you can turn on, you can watch CNN for an entire week, like the Ludovico technique, and you will not see any of those things covered in CNN 1 second. And I'm struck by the response that we always get is just very inspiring. People feel those connections kind of instinctively, and I just wanted to see like how, because there's the common conception is that while you do have to work and with people in their communities and win their struggles at home, how do you do that while also linking it to all these struggles from around the world, not just going on today, but historically? Because I think that's it gives people a sense that they're part of something bigger, and it can be very inspiring.
Whatever politicians may say, in reality, all economies are linked in some way. Because you import materials to make things, you need places to export them to. And in the case of Britain, there is no choice but to be a trading nation. And that means that you have to have some bearing on what goes on in other places. And so recently we had a dispute at Rolls-Royce, which is a major employer. This was the aero engine division of Rolls-Royce, and they were trying to close a factory in Barnoldswick in the northwest of Britain in Lancashire in order to transfer some of the work to Spain and some to Singapore, and at the same time basically get rid of a workforce, that a very highly skilled workforce that had loyally worked for Rolls-Royce for 50 years. It's a very long-standing factory. They had a strike for a whole long time. The strike was very much based in the community. And the picket line became a place where people would leave food donations for the food banks for the poor people in the town, as well as for those on strike. They won. They won the strike. They won the argument. The factory stays open. They forced negotiations on Rolls-Royce. It was obviously a big international dimension to the dispute. And so when you talk of workers' rights protection, if you don't hardwire them into trade agreements, then what we're doing is taking part in the diminution or damaging of the rights of workers elsewhere. If you force into a trade agreement that you cannot buy products that have been made by child labor, by slave labor, that are environmentally damaging, if they're making clothes, pouring chlorine into rivers, for example, and there's many, many other examples, then you're not going to make any progress. So we do have to be international about it. And it's if you just turn up at a local meeting that's concerned about the closure of a school or a hospital, or is campaigning for an improvement in some local facility, and you're very patronizing and give them a lecture about there are other people in an even worse situation elsewhere in the world, you won't get a hearing and people won't take you very seriously. If you take seriously the issue that's in front of you, of that community that's faced with it, then you will get a hearing on all the other issues as well. You've got to meet people where they are, and develop those debates and those arguments. And surely this time of all times, as we hopefully come out of the corona crisis, there's going to be the big debate. Are we going to pay for corona by slashing public spending, by increasing taxation on the poorest and in the middle classes? I realize middle classes means totally different things on both sides of the Atlantic. I find that strange, but there we are. And at the same time, not put windfall taxes on those that have made an absolute fortune. They're like war profiteers, actually, these people that have made a great deal out of Corona. Or are we going to say this is the time to invest in housing, invest in schools, invest in jobs, invest in the future, and run a budget deficit to achieve that? I see nothing wrong with that whatsoever. And the strange thing is, I was lambasted just over a year ago for proposing to spend substantial sums of money on ending university fees, on investment in housing, public ownership of rail, mail and water, and free broadband for everybody. I was accused by one of the right-wing papers, the Daily Mail, of promoting broadband communism. I'm still trying to get behind the concept of broadband communism, but I remember you could do a Christmas quiz. What is broadband communism? I mean, it's a fascinating idea. And I was condemned, saying this is ludicrous, giving everybody a computer, giving everybody access to it. A year later, there's Tory MPs and the right wing getting up saying, well, everybody needs access to the internet. You know, things come full circle in the end, you know.
They do.
And so I think we've got that. But the two other things, if I may mention, of international solidarity work. This year is COP26. And I'm very pleased that one of the first things Biden did was to say he would re-sign up to Paris. I was at the Paris Climate Change Accords. I watched the proceedings there. It was fascinating. It was interesting. The significance of Paris was that all countries were there, and they did agree on a net zero 2050, which very few are anywhere near achieving, but they did agree on it. COP26 comes up this year in Glasgow, in Scotland, and unless we actually agree on net zero by 2030, and it's not just about CO2, carbon dioxide emissions and global warming, it's also about global pollution, and it's also about loss of biodiversity. And unless we sign up to all of those protocols, then the next generation is going to live in a very, very different and much more dangerous world. And so, to me, the environmental movements are absolutely crucial. And again, a green revolution, a real green revolution, won't be like the steam revolution and the electricity revolution and the super tech revolution, all of which move power and wealth to the richest. This would be one that would move it in absolutely the opposite direction. And so we spend a lot of time developing a whole green industrial revolution strategy. And I'm very proud of what we achieved there. And one of the 4 strands of work that we're doing from the Peace and Justice Project is on green industrial revolution and campaigning. And if I may say so, one other international area we got to mention is this: war, peace, justice. The UN General Assembly voted for a global ban on nuclear weapons. The vast majority of the world's countries feel quite comfortable living without nuclear weapons. The majority of the world's population almost could live in nuclear-free areas. But it's a minority of the world's countries, basically the declared nuclear weapon states plus India, Pakistan, and Israel that have nuclear weapons. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is coming up. I think this is a time to move very fast on international justice for it. And I was pleased that both the US Congress and the Russian Parliament agreed to extend the START Treaty by a year. That's got to be a positive, but it's not the end of it. We've got to move on from there. We cannot now, with all the problems of the world, go into a global arms race. Crazy. It's utterly crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about what it's like to be part of a party that has leadership that disagrees with you fundamentally on a number of issues, because there are certainly parallels between the Labour Party in the UK and the Democratic Party here in the United States. And in the US, there has been this raging debate. It's been going on since 2016 regarding the inability to really make change from within the Democratic Party. So there are, people who believe that maybe we need to break off and do a third party, which has all sorts of obstacles that stand in the way of actually accomplishing what the left wants to accomplish in this country. But, you have remained in the Labor Party. You've been in the Labor Party since you were a teenager. And you never really allowed for the disagreements among labor leaders and yourself to push you out of the party. So talk to me about your thoughts on that and why it is that you've remained so loyal to the Labor Party.
I think it's you've got to be careful of drawing an exact parallel between the Labor Party and the US Democrats. I went to Cleveland, Ohio in, I think it was 95 or 96. There was an attempt to form a US Labor Party, and I was a guest at that conference. It was absolutely fascinating. There were a lot of people there from all over the USA, from unions and mostly people that were in the Democratic Party, usually active in local areas with support for particular candidates. And the whole question was the many obstacles in the way of forming a Labour Party on the parallel of the sort of model we've got. The UK Labour Party is unique amongst socialist parties in that it was founded by trade unions rather than trade unions being set up by the party. That's quite a big difference. And trade unions have always had a very big role within the Labour Party, and it was set up originally with no local organisation. It was such local organisations came was through trades and labour councils, which were local labour activists and trade union activists coming together. Now it's obviously moved on into a political party with individual membership, but it still has union affiliation, and half the votes at the conference come from affiliated trade unions. I joined the Labour Party when I was 16 in the 1960s, and I then, at that time, probably my first meeting, disagreed with the political but not military support being given by Harold Wilson to the war in Vietnam. But I felt that it was the place to mobilize people, and it was the place to argue for policies. And so I have been in the Labour Party, as you say, all of my life. And disagreeing with others in a political party is not, to me, a badge of shame. As long as you do it in an intelligent way and you are actually putting forward a credible alternative to that which you disagree with, I think it's fair enough. I mean, plenty of people disagreed with me during my time as leader of the Labour Party, some of them in a completely unreasonable way, some of them more nuanced. But I think it is right to have that debate within a political party. Now, I've got a lot of admiration for the socialist grouping within the US Democrats, and we have kept in touch with them, and indeed I would hope they'll work with us on this project for peace and justice that we've set up, which is a way of not taking over or supplanting campaigns but supporting them. Now, in Britain, the Labour Party membership rose from 200,000 to when I stepped down as leader, it reached 600,000 members, the largest it had ever been in history. And I want that membership to be mobilized and to be powerful. Does it mean there's going to be political debates about the direction we go? Yes, of course it does. And you should never be afraid of those debates. I just say this, there's no future for left politics that doesn't challenge economic injustice and inequality, social injustice and inequality, and global issues that I've mentioned, pandemic, environment, and wars. That has to be the base on which we do things. Now, I've also, during my political life, been involved in many other campaigns that involve people from other organizations. I was a founder of the Stop the War Coalition in 2001. This was in response not to Iraq, because Iraq hadn't been thought of at that time. That was in response to the bombing of Afghanistan by George Bush and with the support of Tony Blair. And we felt it was wrong. And so we decided, despite the apparent huge popular support on both sides of the Atlantic for what Bush was proposing to do, with only Barbara Lee in your system voting against it in Congress, was to set up the Stop the War Coalition. And I supported it, of course, but I was quite skeptical that we'd get much support. So I remember one of the friend of mine, Chris Ninen, who Stop the War, phoned me up and said, Jeremy, we booked the room for the meeting. We booked the big hall at Friend's house, not Friend's house, at a smaller hall in Red Lion Square in London. And I said, oh, God, that's a bit risky. We might not fill it. And then more and more people kept phoning up and registering. This was not exactly pre-internet, but it wasn't as dominant as it is now. And then we moved to a place called Friends Meeting House on Euston Road, which is much bigger. And I went down there after I'd finished my local advice surgery in my constituency, cycled down there, locked up my bike, and there was just thousands and thousands of people all around the building. And we ended up doing 5 overflow meetings all around the building, in the street and in the park and in lots of ante-rooms and things, before addressing the packed hall of it. And that was the birth of the Stop the War movement against the war in Afghanistan. And then we developed, obviously, in opposition to Iraq, when we mobilized well over 1 million people on the streets of London in February 2003. And so that involved people of all kinds of different organizations and peace groups, and it did come together as a massive movement. And I think that has helped to, hasn't stopped all aggression, obviously, it hasn't stopped all wars, but it has helped to change the agenda. And that is the important thing, is change the agenda for debate. But the other area of work that our project is very keen on developing, and this is why we want to work with your good selves, is on media. Because we have a dominant global media by a very small number of companies. Now, I am not, as you probably gathered, a great admirer or fan of Donald Trump. You probably picked that up during this discussion. I don't suppose you two are either. He had his Twitter account removed. Now, I've got no time for Trump, but I think we should think quite carefully about the power of a media corporation, in this case, Twitter, think Facebook, etc., to decide who can communicate with who else. Now, that is actually a very serious and enormous level of power, just as, in the same way, global media through Fox, through Murdoch-inspired Fox and others, sets a news agenda and sets news values. And if I can give you one other anecdote, do you mind?
Of course.
Don't mind at all.
I got all day.
News values. I was in the Democratic Republic of Congo some years ago visiting. I'd been to refugee camps, and I'd been talking to refugees and talking to people who were going through horrendous times because of the grabbing of minerals by big companies from the Congo, with unbelievable levels of poverty around them. And I was in Goma, and there was a plane crash. A plane had sought to take off from the airport. It was probably overloaded, and there was a lava stream from a volcano that had gone across the runway and solidified, and lava is very, very hard, and they had no equipment with which to remove it. So the planes were instructed to make sure they lifted off before they hit the lava stream point on the runway. This plane didn't. It ran over it. It crash landed. It hadn't really taken off, crashed into very poor housing at the end of the runway, which obviously shouldn't have been there. And a lot of people were killed. The UN force that was in the area, the peacekeeping force, to their credit, went there straight away and did everything. They were Indian soldiers, went there and did everything they could to help. And then about 2-3 hours later, I got a phone call from a media source in London saying, "Oh, Mr. Corbyn, we understand you're in Goma at the moment. Is that correct?" I said, "Yes, I am." "We understand there's been a plane crash." I said, "Yes, it's very tragic." And this guy said, "Look, to cut to the chase, was anybody killed or injured?" I said, "Yeah. A lot of people have been killed and injured, poor people living in their homes, as well as those on the plane." I said, he said, have you got any names? Do you know who? I said, no. He said, well, who was really affected? I said, are you really ringing me to check if there's any Europeans or Americans that have been injured? Or are you interested in the effect on poor people in a village at the end of a runway? And he said, well, you know how the news works. We want to know if there was any Europeans there.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
And I
mean,
said,
it's true. We see it in the way all sorts of
Yeah.
tragedies are talked about and covered in the news, especially
wars.
when it has to do with our own actions abroad in these endless wars. You know, when we hear about casualties, it's far less likely that we'll hear about civilian casualties abroad as opposed to, you know, U.S. soldiers who die while, in combat. It's really frustrating.
well, also the numbers of soldiers in the US that committed suicide after Vietnam was greater than the number, I believe, that even died in the Vietnam War.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think most Americans are more or less aware of how many American soldiers died in Vietnam, but have no idea how many Vietnamese people were killed in the Vietnam War, let alone Laotian or Cambodian people. They just have no concept of it, just because the media doesn't cover that at all. It's not part of their news.
I mean, when I go to the US, I'm shocked at the numbers of people sleeping on the streets and the number of them who are ex-soldiers.
Yeah.
I remember
Yeah,
I went to the Senate in 2015 to lobby over Guantanamo. And I just met this guy outside a cafe who was begging. I gave him some money and talked to him. And I said, what's your story? What's happened? And he went through it all. I mean, he wasn't particularly of the left. He'd been a soldier all his life. And he said, you know, I served my country. I did everything I could. And this is how they served me.
Yeah. No, it's, I mean, Anna and I both live in LA, which is, you know, the capital of the homelessness crisis here in the United States. And it's, you know, you see tons of veterans. I mean, tons of veterans. It's a shocking percentage. Well, I want to just end and to wrap up. By the way, thank you for missing Arsenal versus Manchester United. By the way, 0-0 full time. It's just.
Is it 0-0 full time?
0-0 full time. Yeah. You know, not a bad result.
Well, it's just down the road from here. Actually, we can almost, if there was anybody there, we could have heard the crowd from this office.
Right.
But
yeah, it's tough. I'm tempted to ask you about Arsenal, but I won't. I'm tempted to ask you about Arsenal, but I won't. I don't want to get you in trouble. I want to end because I want to ask you about, you know, this kind of age-old question for the left. I mean, Tony Benn, who I know you're a great admirer of, said in 1979 that a serious socialist strategy must begin with the usual problems of the reformer. We have to run the economic system to protect our people who are locked into it while we change the system. How did your time in the later labor leadership make you think about that? You know, what should socialists like us do to transform society?
We obviously looked at this a great deal, and John McDonnell, as our Treasury spokesperson, put a huge amount of work into that. The principles behind it were redistribution of power and wealth, investment in the manufacturing industry, higher minimum wage to turn into a living wage, but above all, empowering workers. And so whilst at the headline, the issue was our proposals on public ownership, which were the entirety of the railway network, because at the moment there's quite a lot of private enterprise running trains. The Royal Mail, which was privatized and it was disgraceful the way it was privatized, and it should be brought back into public ownership, and the water supply industry. We also proposed that telecoms through free broadband would have an element of public enterprise in it. We also proposed energy, which we would bring the national grid into public ownership and also invest in localized energy as well as renewable energy sources. But those were the sort of headlines. But the other side of it was actually more interesting in a sense. It was about local economic forums that would be given power. It was about regional investment banks that would be run by a combination of unions, local economic activists in the sense of people running business in the area and trade unions. And they would decide on the levels of capital and infrastructure investment within those different parts of the UK, because there are massive regional imbalances despite it being a quite small country. But there were other things that were very powerful indeed. One was when a company goes under or goes into administration, the workforce as a whole must be given the chance to take over the company with public funding and public support to do so. And we would also fund and empower cooperatives. So yes, it is reformist, and I fully understand that, but it would be something that would educate and empower people. We would also have ended university tuition fees, which at the moment are £9,000 per year. I realise compared to some universities in the USA, that probably sounds quite cheap, but
Yes.
I think there is a principle that there should be education free from cradle to grave. And so our proposal was to establish a national education service which would oversee all aspects of education, the principle being that everyone should have free access to education, including adult education, where people who had not achieved what they wanted to or as much as they might have done in school got the opportunity to go back to college, university, or to fund things like the Open University, which is very important as a way of giving people another chance. But it's also about the value of learning. So all of those things. And one of the things that was, some people thought it was a bit niche, but I was very proud of it. We put in there, we would set up a pupil arts premium so that every child in every school, irrespective of their income, could learn a musical instrument in school, experience the theatre whilst in school, and understand the value of poetry, literature, and music alongside science, languages, maths, and all the other things. Because what we do in education too often is drive the imagination out of our young people. We drive it out of them by filling them up with tests and exams when we should be encouraging them to think as widely as they possibly can. I want young people to grow up with hope and with imagination and an understanding of the rest of the world. And we were very keen to develop all of those things. And we still are doing all of that. We're doing all of that through this project, through community activity and community action. And that begins to change the debate. Labour won in 1945 in Britain, not because of the brilliance of an election campaign at the end of the Second World War, but because of the anger at the way the poorest people were treated during the Great Depression of the 1930s and the brutality of the means test, where people lost bits of their furniture or their homes because they were deemed to have too much, and therefore they couldn't access national assistance at that time. It was the anger of the brutality of that system and the growth of what was called the Left Book Club, which brought together people of all kinds of left opinion to discuss things and so on, and they became the key activists. And so there are points in history when it might look really bad, but also there are people working away, mobilizing, encouraging, and above all, giving hope to people. Surely that is what is so necessary in this world.
Absolutely.
I love that.
I feel incredibly hopeful after that answer. Absolutely.
Me too. And I love, your emphasis on the arts, because I agree with you. I think that that creativity is such an important part of inspiring people. And, when we talk about innovation, innovation doesn't just simply happen through competition. It happens through people feeling inspired by things and having the ability to kind of think freely. So I love that you mentioned that. It's so important.
One of my favorite poets is Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who I'm sure you're aware of. He wrote, he was a strange character in lots of ways, most poets can be. But one of his great friends was Humphrey Davy, who developed electricity. And neither saw it odd that one was a poet and one was a scientist. And they crossed over and talked about each other's interests. And Davy saw inspiration in poetry, and Coleridge saw inspiration in science through poetry. And so we shouldn't always put people in boxes, because boxes are not a great place to live.
No, no, it's absolutely not.
Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. We really appreciate the conversation, and our audience absolutely loved the conversation. They're hoping that you launch a podcast of your own. I saw some of those comments. So,
well, we've got our 4 work streams with the project, one of which is media, and I'm very sure that what's going to come out of that is our own podcast. So, but it's not competition with your good selves. It's sharing this thing. It's
absolutely.
sharing
the more the better. We would love that. Absolutely love that. Mr. Jeremy Corbyn, thank you again for taking the time to be here. We appreciate it, and we hope you come back soon.
My pleasure.